Well, let's discuss this further. Let's discuss Wagner fighters' presence in Africa. For this, we're going to be joined via Zoom by Prof Hennie Strydom, Professor of International Law at the University of Johannesburg. Prof Strydom, good afternoon. Thank you for your time with us here on the SABC.
Good afternoon.
Many want to understand the context of the Wagner Group in Africa. Perhaps you could help explain that to us. What is the group doing in Africa, and in terms of their future in Africa, is it uncertain as we speak? Help us understand in lieu of the developments.
Yeah, the Wagner Group is quite active in various parts of Africa, in Mali, in the Sahel region, and also in the Central African Republic. And the viewers will probably recall that they were also involved in Mozambique, when Mozambique experienced the insurgency a while ago, and they were not very successful there. But it is quite clear that they are in these countries by agreement with the politicians or the government of that country, and they are also performing certain functions for politicians and for government institutions. There is also evidence that they control mining operations, and that is that's part of their financial system and the way in which they sustain themselves. I think that it is quite evident that the involvement of the Wagner Group in Africa is some kind of an attempt to counter the presence of American involvement, military involvement in Africa, and also the French involvement. And we are also well aware of China's involvement in Africa. So it seems to me that Russia is trying to get some kind of a foothold via this route in Africa. And that raises the question whether the Wagner units operating in Africa are there by authority of the Russian government, or are they performing completely independent of the government functions in Africa by agreement with governments in Africa. That is very difficult to say at this point in time. It seems that they are, objectively seen, it seems that they're operating in terms of their own objectives and in terms of their own command structures. But that doesn't say that they're also not getting instructions from the Russian government, but that part is unclear at this point in time.
Prof, thank you for that context, because that is one of the questions: under whose authority are they operating in Africa, and their state of independence as well. And I wonder, given what happened over the weekend in terms of the mutiny, what is being reflected in terms of Russia's political system, and ultimately, would this rebellion have had any impact on Africa?
I don't think so. I think that was the Prigozhin sort of outfit or activities in Ukraine, totally separate from what's happening in Africa. And I think the different factions that we have of the group in Africa also, it seems to me, operating independent of one another. And I don't think that what happened in Russia recently will affect what is happening in Africa as far as the Wagner Group's involvement is in the different parts of Africa.
What about a response from the African Union in terms of the Wagner's presence to date in Africa? At this point, will the presence be opposed, just given the benefits or lack thereof in some of the African countries in relation to the actors, non-state actors, etc.?
That is a fundamental issue. The Wagner Group has been accused of serious human rights violations where they operate. It's well documented. And there's a long history in Africa of discontent with mercenaries, if we can call the Wagner Group a mercenary outfit. And one would have thought that the African Union would have sort of acted more strongly against the operation of Wagner units in Africa. But they are not the only mercenary groups or private military companies operating in Africa. There are others as well. But there is, I think, a lack of decisive decision-making by the African Union and by various subunits in Africa like SADC and ECOWAS about the operation of private military companies in Africa. Given the history of mercenaries in Africa and given the destabilization potential these groups have, their support for rogue governments and rogue politicians and the human rights violations, one would have thought that there would have been a stronger reaction to their presence in Africa.
No, absolutely. Prof, let me wrap up this conversation. Do you think what transpired in Russia over the weekend is going to have any impact on Russian President Vladimir Putin coming to South Africa, perhaps also in terms of the peace negotiations that was led by African leaders just a few weeks back?
Yeah, I think it has opened up for us in the rest of the world what the problems are facing Russia internally. That there's discontent amongst the different groups, and discontent about the way the war is going, or has been approached or strategized by Putin and his army. And I think that is significant, but at this point in time, I think it has more of sort of internal consequences, and we will have to see how this is going to be handled. For instance, we do not know where Prigozhin is at this moment. The allegations are that he has gone to Belarus, but whether he is safe in Belarus is, of course, anybody's guess, given past incidents of people being poisoned or whatever the case might be. So I think we'll probably see more evidence coming forward in the near future, which will give us a better picture of what's going on.
Absolutely, Prof. Thank you for your time with us here on the SABC. For those sentiments echoed, Professor Hennie Strydom, Professor of International Law at the University of Johannesburg, weighing in on the developments since the mutiny at the weekend, of course, shining a spotlight on the Wagner Group, their presence in Africa, and whether they will be impacted going forward, given obviously what transpired over the weekend.